Okay, well, David, could you start by just telling us a little bit about your background as a musician and what drew you to composing?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for having me and for performing Haunted Topography. It's great to meet you and everybody on the call. I grew up in a pretty musical family, so I was always surrounded by music. My father was at one point played guitar and drums, so I had instruments lying around the house. And my parents met actually doing a production of West Side Story, so there were musical theater was sort of around. We always had records of musical theater that were being played when I was a kid. And so music was always sort of very much part of my upbringing. Um, it wasn't until I was about 15 years old that I thought that it would be something I would do for a career. And that came actually through film music. I had been a drummer. I started playing drums when I was around age 8 and played in a fife and drum corps in New Jersey where I grew up. So I learned a lot of sort of colonial era and Civil War era music. And played in rock bands as a drummer. And then I went to see The Nightmare Before Christmas when I was 15, and it kind of brought all of these worlds together, the sort of rock and roll, heavy metal side of my upbringing and what I was listening to at the time with a kind of dark vision of musical theater and kind of cabaret stuff. So it all kind of came together, and I realized for the first time that this person, Danny Elfman, um, that this was his job to write this music. And I realized he had also written Beetlejuice and Batman and these other film scores that I knew, and I thought, oh, I want that job. And the rest of my life since then has been figuring out how to get that job and keep that job.
Very cool. Um, so in the program note for this piece, Haunted Topography, you give a brief description about how it's supposed to be a meditation on a story that was told to you by the founder of this veteran rehabilitation program called Vet to Vet. So I was wondering if you could just
Mm-hmm.
tell us a little bit about that and how this piece came to be.
Sure. So, yeah, Mo Armstrong and I were sharing a panel in New Haven in, I want to say 2010 or 11. And it was at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, and we were giving the premiere of a sort of new production of my first opera, Soldier Songs. And Mo and I were being interviewed as part of a panel, as part of the ideas part of the Arts and Ideas platform. And part of this, during this interview, he told this story about someone he had counseled um, in his work in veteran rehabilitation of this woman whose son had been killed in Vietnam, and that she was unable to begin her grieving process until she saw on a map where it had happened. And something about that story really hit me and really stuck with me. And questions of grief and mourning are run through a lot of my work in different ways. And this was this very, I thought, very profound and unique expression of that process and that experience. And, a year or two later, I had an opportunity to compose originally a piece for chamber orchestra for Sinfonietta. Um, and a lot of my work start with ideas or concepts or titles. And as I sort of sat down to start thinking about this piece, this story came back to me, and immediately the title, Haunted Topography, sort of presented itself. And from there, the piece kind of wrote itself pretty quickly. Um, I think I was able to connect with the emotional world of the piece, and that's always sort of the first step for me. So once that happened, then the piece sort of revealed itself pretty quickly.
So can
And
you
it's dedicated to Mo. Actually, the piece is dedicated to Mo Armstrong.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really compelling story. And I don't know if you know this, but we're putting this as the final piece on a program called Battles Within that's supposed to describe like a veteran's emotional
Mm,
journey from going off to conflict and coming back and going through these stages of, new
right.
beginnings, grief, and then like instability, and then hopefully healing at the end of it. Um, can you describe, like, do various parts of the work represent different parts of that story? Like, I noticed, at the beginning, you put the phrase, like the slow hand of a heavy clock, which I thought was
Mm,
really, which says it's slower than 60, but for that, the piano and the vibraphone, like just steady
yeah.
pulses. And that continues throughout the piece with there's a little bit of rhythmic variation, but is that supposed to represent the passage of time, like how that the passage of time feels for that mother throughout the piece? And are there other, and if so, like are there just specific things in that piece that you could talk about that would represent specific things that you thought of with regard to that story?
I don't think it's programmatic in that sense. It's not sort of depicting events along a pathway of recovery or of mourning. But I think it starts from that sort of emotional place and it lives very much within it. Time and the passing of time is kind of a musical obsession of mine. And I'm a firm believer that as composers, we have this unique ability to alter our audience's perception of how time passes, which is this sort of superpower that we have. And so I think this, and this is something I always only kind of realized recently, but subconsciously, time and this sort of sense of pulse and the sense of a clock being slightly too fast or slightly too slow or slower than actual time is something that creeps up through so many of my pieces. It was only maybe a year ago that I looked at it and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with this idea." So I think it just came from that idea. And I was also, I should say, at the time I was studying Chopin quite a lot and the Chopin preludes. And so this is the I think it's the E minor prelude that has a sort of pulse to it. And I think the way that the piano voicings move in that in haunted topography and the sense of pulse are really uh, channeling that as well.
Mm-hmm. So when you hear a story like you're and you felt inspired to write something about it, like how does that, can you describe a little bit like your approach to like translating that narrative into like actual musical language and structure?
It's funny composing. I sort of get to a place where I'm not completely aware of what I'm doing when I'm doing it. It's sort of this flow state when it's kind of really happening, so I don't know that I can say specifically what I'm thinking at any one moment. Part of it is you're just thinking about making the sounds work together, you know. That's on the one level, it's that, and on another level you're just trying to, for me at least, I'm always just trying to feel what the sort of emotional or psychological state of the work is. I think partially because I write a lot of opera and I write a lot of works that live in theatrical spaces and film spaces. So
Mhm.
stories of people and emotional states of people are really central to how I think of just about everything. And so even though this is not a narrative piece and it's not necessarily programmatic in the sense, the weight of, I think, the slow hand of a heavy clock, right? The idea of the weight of carrying a weight emotionally for many years and then being able to um, shed that weight, or have a cathartic expression of that weight. I feel like that's something that you see in the form of the piece, and that last gesture where everything kind of goes crazy and it gets,
Mhm.
the low brass comes in and you have this, the bass drum and everything just gets really loud and really cathartic, and it's sort of expressing and releasing a kind of chaotic energy within the context of this passing of time. Still, I think that is, I'm sure, on some level, although I wasn't thinking like this is the moment that that this character in my mind releases this cathartic energy. I think that's the formal shape of it, and that's, as I felt my way through it as I was writing it, that felt like what was necessary, especially when you're dealing with just musical ideas of tension and release. That's the sort of the ultimate release. um, and I think the very end of the piece, there's this ringing that happens after the last chord releases. The piano and the vibraphone hold on, right, and they fade out naturally, and I think that's also part of that sense of a kind of lingering energy or a kind of reverb tail that is suggests that this continues in some way, that this is just part of a larger story.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's basically, I was, I've been trying to like, make sense of it thematically, like emotionally for me. And so it really felt like that section where the the violins are just like going crazy and making these ugly
Yeah, yeah,
sounds. Everything is so big and low that it's just like from all this time, like everything's finally like getting released from her, which has to
yeah,
happen before the
right.
healing. It's this huge, like ugly release, like just all this stuff coming
Yeah,
out. And then just that big ending where it just stops and did you put it like feedback, right? The brass chords
yeah,
bridge is
yeah,
like
yeah,
big
yeah,
thing, and
yeah,
then it's just like done. And then it's just like you had to get all that out and now you can go on. That's how it felt to
yeah,
me. I was hoping that was
yeah,
somewhat close to what you had
yeah.
envisioned
Oh,
in your head.
definitely. Definitely. It's definitely about release, that ending. And so much of the piece is about this idea of carrying this tension or carrying this weight or carrying this heaviness. So much of it starting in the low, you have the passing of time and then you have the melody entering in the low voices.
Mhm.
And only gradually does it brighten into the upper strings. And then the winds have these solo passages that are kind of breaking out of that context, but still kind of within it, still confined by time. And then you have that moment at the end with the strings where they're just, the string players all have boxes with a gesture in it, with a kind of almost a visual gesture, like kind of not quite a squiggle, but a
Yeah.
um, lines rather than notes. And so it becomes this, for them, this individual expression, this improvisational moment where they are not reading the same music or they're not playing the same music as their neighbors. And it creates this sort of massive sound um, that I think can have that kind of cathartic moment to it.
Yeah, definitely. So you wrote two versions of this, right? Because I read that the first one is for this Sinfonietta, and then you
Right.
were commissioned to write this version by Christopher James Lee. And so
Yeah.
what are some of the, I imagine there's like a ton more percussion in the orchestral version, right? Because there's so much percussion
I
in
don't think
this.
there's that much. So originally we had two percussionists.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know how. I don't think it's changed. I don't have the score in front of me. I should have it in front of me to check this. But originally it was I think 12 or 13 players, and then I did actually a second version for Sinfonietta that added a bass clarinet in addition to a B flat clarinet. So then you had, I think actually in one moment that becomes two bass clarinets and bassoon or contrabassoon to get that really low gesture at the end. And then the orchestral version, it was really about I think you have so much more potential for lush textures, but it's interesting because the piece it's not really about that. It's still quite streamlined in a way. Um, and so yeah, it's funny. I don't remember the process of doing the orchestral version. It's been a while now. I mean, the original piece was what 2011. And I
Hmm.
think the orchestra version was 2014, so it's 10 years ago or so. Um, but I don't think there is all that much more percussion,
Okay.
actually.
Well,
I
we
think it's just maybe played, not, one player doesn't have to do multiple things
yeah.
now. So they're easier percussion parts than in the original version.
Well, I really had just one more question. Just sort of how do you see like the enduring relevance of this piece, like in the context of contemporary music and societal themes?
Yeah, I mean, this piece is connected very intimately with this piece, Soldier Songs, which was originally premiered in 2006 and hasn't really stopped being programmed since then.
Mhm.
And and that's the piece that really is about veterans and the question of what we ask, uh, what war does to the people who fight it, basically.
Mhm.
And what's been interesting with that piece, and to a certain extent with this piece as well, with Mo, some of the people I interviewed, and I should say Soldier Sons is based on interviews with friends and family members who were in the service. So people who had seen combat in both the First World War, I'm sorry, Second World War, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and then in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, and, you know, being in touch with these people as I am, and seeing this piece as often as I have, I find it's difficult um, for me to experience now because some of I interviewed my grandfather who's no longer living, and so there's a part of it is a sort of time capsule experience, but then part of it is also this timeless story of difficulty and trauma that people take on in service, and in that sense, it is, and I say it's this thing that makes me quite sad that these pieces will never not be relevant, because the experiences that they're exploring are very difficult experiences, but they're also in their way ancient experiences and kind of experiences that go all the way back to the start of human history, and I don't unfortunately don't anticipate they'll um, stop being relevant, or that these experiences will stop happening to people because of what the world is and who we are as a species and as
Yeah.
so-called civilization. Um, so and in terms of um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, and I think one of the things that that I'm very happy with Haunted Topography is it has become, partially through the efforts of Christopher Lees um, and some of the work that he's done, but this is a piece that has been played by a lot of youth orchestras as well, and I feel like that's really special and really important because I think these are questions that future generations are going to have to deal with, and um, if there's a chance that maybe these pieces can be less relevant, it's because of work that younger generation will be doing. So um, that's something I find really meaningful, and I also like the story of Mo and his experience, and the story of this mother and her experience connecting with young people feels important for just from a perspective of historical knowledge and understanding.